Sometimes truth is much scarier than fiction, and this story more than proved that for my friend and I. We live around the city outskirts of Houston. As such, there are a plethora of old rundown buildings in the area, ranging from family homes to large commercial buildings, and one of our favorite pastimes had become urban exploring. There is something hauntingly peaceful about walking through these dilapidated buildings. It's somber getting a sense of who may have lived there from items left behind, the stories of workers and factories that were shut down long ago, and we've come across some very interesting finds. We always mess with each other about how we're going to run into ghosts or attract a haunting while exploring. Not that we really pay those stories much mind, but since we usually explore at night to avoid being seen by guards in the area who look for trespassers, talking about ghosts and spooky things always livens the mood and raises the tension. We picked out an old apartment complex as our next target, 3 stories tall, with plenty of surrounding area we could use for cover as we snuck our way in. After casing the building, though, we noticed there were no good ways in on the first floor, much to our dismay. We did, however, manage to find a slightly ajar porch door on one of the second-story balconies. There was enough debris and boxes around for us to make a platform to use to reach the balcony and pull ourselves up from there. Once both over, we squeezed our way into the apartment through the small opening and were immediately hit with the all-too-familiar smell of a decaying building. We use masks to help keep out dust and debris, but sometimes that smell is a bit much. This apartment complex was the type where the entirety of the complex was internalized. No open-air hallways, parking garage attached to the side at each level, you know. We started by exiting the apartment we were in and looked for a sign on one of the walls that directed to different locations in the complex. After finding a sign that pointed to the direction of a second-floor kitchen, we knew where we wanted to head next. My friend and I use night vision recorders as to not shine bright lights through the buildings that could potentially give our positions away to people outside, and seeing these places through the eerie green light of the lens really set the atmosphere. After walking for a bit down the hall, we found ourselves at the double-door entrance to the kitchen and decided to go in together, one person at each door. These doors didn't open quietly. A noticeable squeak echoed through the room as we pushed past. We paused for a moment, and when we felt we didn't hear anything else, we proceeded to enter the kitchen. It's always amazing what you see get left behind in these places. Most of the kitchen appliances were still here, almost ashamed to see the waste. When the sound of movement back in the hallway caught our attention, I could see through my recorder screen that my friend noticed it as well and was looking back at the doors we used to enter. The sound was on pace to reach the doors any second, and moving my camera off of my friend, I tried scrambling in the dark to find a spot to hide. I eventually crawled inside one of the old cabinets that had been gutted, with no idea where my friend went. When I then heard the sound of the 2 kitchen doors being pushed further open, which was followed by low, heavy breathing. Where are they? They went in here, I'm sure of it. I don't think I've ever felt panic like I did in that moment. I truly thought I would be killed by these 2 men if they found me. They clearly weren't police and didn't identify themselves, and I still didn't know where my friend went. I heard them spread out in the room, opening cabinets and appliances as they went. I could hear the footsteps approaching my cabinet, and as I readied myself to fight with everything I had, there was a loud bang outside down the hall, like a rock breaking a window. The 2 men quickly scrambled back out of the room, and after a few agonizing seconds, I heard my friend call out to me to hurry and head for the door. We met up, paused for a moment, then sprinted with everything we had back to the room we first came in at, thankfully reaching it without running into those men as we practically threw ourselves off the balcony back down to the ground. Not a graceful landing, but better than being dead. My friend told me how he had hidden behind a refrigerator near the door when the men entered the room, and when they had passed him enough, he picked up some debris off the ground, leaned out the doors, and threw it down the opposite way we came, hoping to make some noise. He said he didn't plan to hit a window, but it worked better than he had hoped. His quick thinking probably saved both of our lives that day. I don't know who those men were, and I don't care to find out. All I do know is that we're far more cautious when we explore now. I wouldn't exactly say the town I live in is the most urban town in the world. Not a major city or anything, but the town has been around since the mid to late 1800s, and there's still a fair share of strip malls, suburbs, and the like. I love exploring the area since there's quite the history to be found in a place that's been around since the Civil War. Old churches, abandoned businesses, and there's even a historic landmark of an old settlement plot of land that nature has since reclaimed. Being such an old town, though, of course, comes with its fair share of ghost stories and tales of old cults doing hidden rituals around town. I've admittedly seen some odd things in my time exploring these abandoned places, but nothing quite compared with this particular time. I was on the outskirts of town, looking around the older, more forested area, trying to find a new location to explore. You never know what you may find tucked away around here. When I found what looked like an old sawmill with a connecting house for the workers, or at least that's what it seemed like to the best of my knowledge. There wasn't much left to say for the sawmill, but the house seemed relatively intact, and so I decided to start there. What remained of the front door moved easily enough for me, so I was able to get inside far easier than some places I found in the past. The inside was much more spacious than the outside led me to believe it was, probably to help maximize necessary space for the people living here and working at the mill. I began looking through the house with my flashlight, seeing if there were any old relics left behind that I could catalog into my journal of my adventures. I passed through a closed door that seemed to open up into what I could only think was some type of study, when I was suddenly overcome by the foul smell of something rotting. It hit me like a slap to the face after opening the door, but there was nothing to be seen in the room that would cause such a stench. But as I took my first few steps into the room, the old wood gave out from under me, and I fell about a good 10 feet or so as I crashed through the floorboards. It was a hard landing, and it took me a good few seconds to recollect myself. I almost wish I hadn't. When I gathered my senses, I noticed that the smell was now overwhelming. I felt around for my flashlight in the wet dark, eventually finding it and having to hit it a few times to get it to turn back on. And when it did turn on, I was met by one of the grossest sights I think I've ever seen. There were dead animal carcasses hanging and laying all over this basement. Some fresh, some just skeletons with their bones oddly arranged next to strange patterns that were painted on the walls and floors. It didn't help that I noticed I had fallen into some when I fell, which caused me to reflexively vomit. I was distraught and was well done with this house. I mustered the courage and pushed my way through the bodies and strange occult-like sculptures, doing my best to hold back my tears of fear. I found stairs at the edge of the room that led up to a trap door, which was heavy to move, but luckily didn't seem to be locked. I pushed with everything I had, and the door opened as I was met with the fading sun. I closed the door behind me, noticing that the door had been covered in sod to make it hide and blend in with the surrounding grass. I sprinted harder than practically any other time in my life I can remember, praying I wouldn't run into whoever's basement that was now. I made it back to the more modern side of town, thankfully without running into anyone. I went home, trying to avoid people with knowing how bad I smelled, and after showering and calming down over some food and a beer, I recorded what had happened in my journal and decided that that would probably be the final entry. That basement was more than I thought I would ever find while exploring these old places, and it was more than enough to turn me off the idea of continued exploration. Like I said, there's plenty of stories around town of that kind of activity still happening, but most people either just dismiss the stories or say it's just a bunch of dumb kids messing around for a good scare. I have no idea what sick psychopath that basement belonged to, or who else they may be associated with. I think what scares me the most is that it could be any regular person I walk by on the street, and I would have no idea. Let me start this story by saying that, fun enough, I go to college at a university that was built with deterrence for the Cold War in mind. No joke. Some of the dorms and lecture halls were built to double as bomb shelters. There's an underground network of tunnels that connects key buildings on campus in the event people needed to be moved out of sight. and even an old decommissioned emergency response system. Although most of that is well proven and is a part of the university's history, a lesser known rumor about the campus is that underground beneath it all was a secret intelligence base used back in the day to collect data and run experiments. There were even rumors of a now decommissioned missile silo that wasn't too far away off campus. I'm really into that kind of mystery hunting, and after discovering that the underground tunnels were real by sheer accident one day, I decided to dig further. In my research and exploration, I not only found what was the supposed missile silo, but also strange concrete slabs scattered across town in random places, it seemed. I came across forums talking about how different people had marked the locations of each of these slabs, and how old blueprints of the area showed that these could have acted as entrances and air intake shafts down into the old base that have since been closed off by the slabs. I was finding enough to pique my interest and excitement, to say the least, when the day came that I found a video that was discreetly posted to one of these forums, showing some guy walking up to what looked like a very small bunker entrance, for lack of a better description. I recognized the area he was in, and could trace how I thought he got there. So that evening, I put together a bag of things I thought I would need to go exploring, drove to a spot I knew of a bit outside of campus, and after following what I thought was the same path the guy in the video took, sure enough, I was eventually faced with the same entrance. Just tucked away back here. I tried to keep my excitement down and promptly worked my way down into the opening. It oddly enough wasn't locked, probably from someone else breaking the lock at some other point. I was initially met with a room that looked like it would have been from the Cold War era. Old computer screens, desks, boards on the walls. It was fascinating. I wasn't sure if this was the entrance into the famed facility, but I was going to try and find out. I continued down deeper and deeper into the facility, passing all sorts of different looking rooms that seemed to serve different purposes, when I eventually found myself in what looked like an experimentation room. There were cages, metal tables, medical diagrams, and the like all over the place. It gave off a very unsettling vibe, to put it mildly. I was upset to find that my trail seemed to stop here. The only other two ways to go were a door that was barred shut and another staircase down that seemed to have been completely flooded out. I felt satisfied enough with what I had found, and as I turned to leave, I was met with knocking from behind the barred door. I walked up slowly to the door when more faint knocking happened. I couldn't begin to say what the hell caused me to knock back, but I did, in the same pattern that I had heard the knocks make. It was silent for a few seconds, when the silence was broken by slamming and what sounded like scratching from the other side of the door that was accompanied by a high-pitched howling of sorts. I practically had a heart attack right then and there, and I ran out as fast as I could with what little light I got from my flashlight and with the sound still echoing behind me. I worked my way back out of the facility and back to my car. I just sat for a few minutes, trying to control my breathing and trying to make sense of what just happened. There was no way there was actually something locked up down in there. But if there was, what could it have possibly been? I know that crazed experiments in the name of science have always been a thing in any time period, but I have no clue what was behind that door. I went back a week later to see if anything was different, and not only did I see new no trespassing signs, but I also saw that the entrance had been given new heavy-duty doors with a stronger locking system placed on it. Based on the location I was at, I made the assumption that I would have been close enough to campus for that to have been at least part of the old Intel facility. And if, by chance, each of those concrete slabs were in fact part of the tunnel network, then it makes my mind spin with how big that whole facility must actually be. I've stopped looking into it now for two specific reasons. One is that I'm honestly afraid that I'm being watched now by whoever is responsible for keeping tabs on the old facility, and it's not worth me potentially disappearing one day for knowing too much. You know how that goes. And two, I would much rather live the rest of my life not knowing what was behind that door.